Hey, deserving listeners. Today I'm going to be reviewing a bunch of myths about attachment theory and attachment styles, and I'm going to evaluate each one, talk about the research to some extent. There's a lot to get into. There's a lot of myths to review, so I'm going to take my time on these. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. So someone sent me this website that is the website for Dr. Pascal Vrticka, Associate Professor in Psychology at the University of Essex, UK. And the website, the URL is pvrticka.com. So Vrticka, pascalvrticka.com. And there's a lot of really great stuff in here. I didn't look all of it over, but it looked very science-based and easy to understand, at least as easy as you could make it, given some of the complex topics. But one of the pages on this website addresses a few dozen myths about attachment theory, and I want to get into it. And I think someone sent this to me because they thought that some of these myths were actually contradicting some of the things that I say. So let's get into it. And I should also say that this episode will probably be a little rambly because I'm going to be reading from this website and kind of reacting to it. I have a lot of stuff in my head around the topics that I'm pretty sure a lot of the myths have to do with, but if you're looking for a more organized episode, maybe this isn't the one for you. Anyway, okay. So the first myth that Dr. Pascal Vrticka wants to dispel is dispelled by the following statement. There is no such thing as insecure, disorganized attachment style in adults. So he doesn't provide the myth, he just provides the answer. And there's a possibility that the reason why he does this is because research shows that even if you tell people right after or as you're saying the statement that the statement is wrong, our brains will sometimes retain or only hold on to the false statement. So if I tell you my middle name is Jonathan, and then right after I say, I just lied to you, or it's not Jonathan, then there's a chance that a bunch of people a year from now or tomorrow will be pretty sure that my middle name is Jonathan, even though I just said right afterwards, I just told you a false statement. So sometimes when we're reporting on myths, it can actually backfire because if we say the myth, if we frame it as a myth, but we still say the statement, like the myth that Dr. Pascal is trying to dispel is that there is such a thing as insecure, disorganized attachment style in adults. Okay, so let's get into it. And this is maybe the main one that people thought, wait, I thought Kirk says the opposite. Okay, so let's read it. These days, I see many social media posts and blogs talking about insecure, disorganized adult attachment style. This is a myth. Let's have a closer look. What is disorganized attachment? Disorganized attachment is a classification derived from observations of child behavior towards a caregiver, for example, within the strained situation procedure. Just chiming in, this is all accurate. I talked about this in my deep dive and other times. Disorganized attachment behaviors in children indicate conflict, confusion, and apprehension toward the caregiver when the child is distressed. Just chiming in, so that's a pretty concise way of putting it, that when the child is faced with a scenario in which calls upon their attachment system, behavioral and emotional, to react to the caregiver, the child, usually due to abuse, will react with conflict, with confusion and apprehension. A part of them wants to run to their caregiver, and another part of them wants to run away, and they don't know what to do. So we will call that disorganized attachment because the child doesn't have any way of organizing their attachment impulses. Whereas when you're secure, then there's a way of organizing it. Obviously, when you're avoidant, then the organization is to avoid. If you're preoccupied, anxious, then the solution or the orientation is towards preoccupation and anxiety and clinging, right? Whereas disorganized, there is no system. It's just panic, right? So going on. Disorganized attachment behaviors in children also reflect a state of fright without solution. This can be caused by frightening or frightened, alarmed, or inexplicable caregiver behavior in response to child distress, or by repeated major child separations from the caregiver. Okay, yeah, as you know, it's a clinical way of putting it, essentially abuse, abandonment. But so caused by the child being frightened, which is often due to. Now, I suppose there are rare scenarios where the parents aren't being abusive, but the child either misinterprets things or there's outside forces causing the child to feel afraid, right? So, certainly we can imagine war-torn areas or refugee areas or oppression on a family that could result in the child frequently feeling afraid. But it'd have to be kind of specific, and but the general rule is that a 12-month-old child, a 24-month-old child, when they are afraid, which they often are, especially in strange situations, they immediately have an impulse to run to the secure base, which is the caregiver. And if both the stimulus of the fear and the secure base is the same person, then the child doesn't know what to do, right? So, okay. Disorganized attachment behaviors in children furthermore reflect some degree of systematic disruption in their attachment system functioning. Yeah. The child is no longer able to coherently direct their attention to either their caregiver or the environment. Right. What is not disorganized attachment? Disorganized attachment is not another insecure attachment style, nor is it a more extreme form of insecure, anxious, or avoidant attachment style. Okay, right. So this might contradict the way that I frame it. And the thing is that there's a lot of authors in our field, but the concept is the same across all the authors. There's different terms for this. There's different acknowledgments for a child attachment styles, but even with child attachment style classifications, there's different ways of wording it, but they're all referring to the same thing. There's also a different system when we're describing adults sometimes, but not always. And in my deep dive, I go over this. I go over all the various different terms that you might see clinicians or researchers using. Like with disorganized, you will I say disorganized. So, okay, let's go over the different names. So with secure, there's only really one other term that you'll see in the literature, which is autonomous. But you almost never see autonomous. You almost always see secure across not only clinical literature, research, but also among lay people. So secure, you can be secure that secure word is secure. Then if we talk about my word of preoccupied, often that is not the word that people use. They will say anxious, or they'll say anxious resistant, or they'll say ambivalent. And I, a long time ago, years and years, as a professor, decided that with my students, I needed to use the same word every time. And I just started using the word preoccupied because although anxious does help in terms of describing it, right? Like ambivalent is not, it's not descriptive, right? Like preoccupied, instantly it evokes a vision of a person that is preoccupied with attachment. Yeah, they're frequently talking about it. Anxious is a good word too, but the problem is that sometimes disorganized attachment is called fearful. You will see systems of nomenclature where you'll have secure attachment, anxious attachment, and fearful attachment. So what? So I wanted to get away from both the word fearful and anxious because in a way, all insecure attachment styles are fearful and anxious. They're afraid of loss, of being abandoned. That's the definition of attachment insecurity. So I purposely said, let's go with preoccupied, even though most, in the literature and among lay people, you don't hear the word preoccupied very often. Okay. So with avoidant, you'll see dismissive, which is another pretty good word. Sometimes I'll use avoidant dismissive or dismissive. Those are almost the same word, right? It's a little bit different, but they evoke the same vision for me, of someone that's avoiding. You have preoccupied, which is someone that's constantly thinking about it, someone who's avoiding, who dismisses. There's a little bit different there. Like avoidant is like trying to dodge attachment scenarios because of the fear. Dismissive is more active, of like pushing something away. But anyway, and more like denying that you do have attachment needs, right? But I find, again, I just had to figure out what's the word I'm going to use with my students, what's the word I'm going to use with my listeners to help people to keep things straight. And so I always just use avoidant. A lot of literature, a lot of lay people will use the word avoidant, but you'll also see the other terms. Sometimes you'll see anxious avoidant, which is maybe my favorite term, but confusing if people don't understand, because it's like, wait, are you talking about like a combo between anxious attachment and avoidant? So there's that. There's also dismissive avoidant, which is pretty easy to understand, but I just use avoidant because I want to be consistent across different talks. But know that there are various different terms that people will use, and I just hope that people can translate. There's only 4 attachment styles, so it's not hard to keep track. Sometimes by context you can sort of tell what people are talking about. But anyway, and then the 4th category, now whether or not we call this an attachment style or not, so getting back to this myth by Dr. Pascal, he's saying this is not an attachment style, even though a lot of people claim that it is. So it's a myth that disorganized or fearful avoidant is an attachment style. Okay, so the different words for disorganized, and I landed on disorganized because I think that's the easiest to visualize. But you'll also see a lot of people use the term fearful avoidant, and I'm not a fan of that term because it confuses people in that it can feel like, oh, so they're like a combination of anxious and avoidant, right? You have fear, anxiety, so that you have someone who's preoccupied and avoidant. But no, and a lot of people, lay people and professors, I've heard professors at my university say this, that disorganized attachment is a combo. Now, I will say, I don't blame people for being confused because it's complicated, but that's just not the case. And I will admit that in the beginning of my career, maybe even the beginning of this podcast, I was confused about this as well. So, it is that. But by the time I was becoming more expert in this area, it's pretty clear. Anyway, so with disorganized, you'll see fearful avoidant, you'll see fearful, you'll see unresolved, and you'll see disoriented. So all of these terms are referring to the same thing, referring to the same observation among children and maybe adults, which we'll get into in a second. So disorganized is the same as fearful avoidant, which is the same as fearful, which is the same as unresolved, which is the same as disoriented. Now, some of you who might know the difference might say that's not true. These things are not the same thing. Some things are referring to childhood categories, and some are referring to adult, which we'll get into in a second. But the thing is that when it comes to the linguistics or the terms, I think about it in a more simplified version, in a more integrative version, while acknowledging that it's a bit of a, it's not a, I was going to say it's a bit of a stretch, but it's it's a model for understanding human behavior. It's a model for understanding schemas to some extent. It's a model for understanding relationships, for why people are the way that they are, why we react the way that we react, why that why relationships seem so different across people. For some people it's very easy, for others it's not. For some people it's this, for some people it's that. And it's a way of understanding that. And research informs it greatly, but it's hard to research this because you're talking about, trying to encapsulate the entirety of an individual's relationship style and their emotions and memory and trauma and schema and distortions and the way they see the world. And how can you measure that? A lot of these measures are self-report, right? We don't have the money or maybe even the ability really to observe a human and scientifically in a concrete way codify exactly how they are reacting, because we don't know what's going on inside of them and everything. There's a lot of subjectivity here, right? Like the security you feel in your long-term romantic relationship, it's a very subjective thing. And if you see someone freaking out, is it because they have distortions or some kind of attachment insecurity that's playing a role, or are they reacting the way that people, quote unquote, should react? These are impossible questions to answer, but we need some way of, or at least it helps to have some model of understanding it. So when we talk about childhood attachment styles versus adult attachment styles, how connected are they? Which I'll get into in a second. There's a lot of science around this, and when people like Dr. Pascal will say that disorganized attachment is not an attachment style, it just kind of depends on what you mean by attachment style. If we get into like the specifics for certain writers, that's a true statement. For others, it's not. One way of thinking about it with disorganized attachment is that it's the absence of a style. And I will say that sometimes, in that when you have secure attachment style, your style of attaching, your style of reacting to attachment threat, your style of returning to your person or your people when you are afraid or threatened, like you have a bad day at work, what do you want to do? Well, you want to connect with someone that you love, that trusts you and loves you and will take care of you. And if you have secure attachment style, then you have a working model of self and other that is generally positive. And so you believe that you're generally a good person and that your people that you have built secure relationships with can be depended on. And you head towards them in a uncomplicated, generally speaking way. And if they are a little distracted, you don't take it that personally, but you still can take it personally because there are some things that are viable to take personally. And plus, even secure people make mistakes sometimes. But generally speaking, there's a trust, there's regulation, there's the ability to build over time a relationship. So that's secure, that's a style, that's a tendency, that's a way of seeing the self and other. Okay. With preoccupied, this is a style of leaning in, of pursuing, of demanding, of noticing, of hypervigilance. Then you have avoidance, dismissive. This is a style of avoiding, a style of dismissing, denying, pushing away, shutting down, turning off emotions while still having them for the most part. Being independent pathologically, it's it's a way of dealing. Okay, I feel an attack. Same scenario. You had a bad day at work, and let's say the bad day at work made you feel like you weren't a good person or that you aren't likable or something. Someone at work or a customer or a boss just made you feel like a little worthless, and you're worried that maybe you don't have what it takes. Maybe you're not a good person. Maybe you're worthless. Maybe you're bad at something. Maybe you're not lovable or not good or whatever. And for the avoidant person, they tend not, as a style, doesn't mean that they don't, it just means it's a style, right? It's a tendency. They tend to avoid. So they won't reach out for help. They will convince themselves that everything's okay. They don't need other people. And they might even avoid scenarios at work that challenge that, or maybe get a different job or just quit, right? Because it's easier to avoid and run. those are severe things, but generally speaking, it would be shutting down, not going home and asking for help, not calling a friend, not telling your boss at work, hey, that hurt my feelings or whatever, and convincing the self that you're good on your own. You don't need people and that you're logical or whatever. For the preoccupied person, the threat from the boss or the customer of worthlessness would be very noticeable to that individual. It'd be very disruptive. They tend to have a negative working model of self, and so their style of dealing with that, because we heard the secure style, we heard the avoidant style, now we're hearing the preoccupied style. These people tend to pursue, to lean in, to feel their emotions, to notice their emotions, maybe even neurologically have bigger emotions, and as a way to alert them that there's a danger, and therefore the emotions are more noticeable and more motivating to the person to do something about it. And so they might go home and because they're very stressed out, they might seek solace from their spouse, and if their spouse is perfect, then they will be mostly soothed, but they still have to return to work, depending on the severity of the preoccupied attachment. But if the spouse is a little distracted or could be interpreted as a little distracted, then the preoccupied person will downward spiral because it's yet again, I'm being abandoned, no one cares about me, and more feeling, more alerting, more demanding, more clinging, more anger, more, hey, you need to change, and that's a different style. Okay. Now, the avoidant person and the preoccupied person are both not getting their needs met in different ways, and one is more tumultuous, in the moment than the other. But avoidant people can be very tumultuous. They can be very angry. They can be very sad in very brief periods of time. They can be very confused. They can tend to abuse alcohol and drugs as a way to cope, and that can create a lot of chaos. Anyway, so when it comes to disorganized people, you could say that way of reacting to attachment, threat, worthlessness at work, and they want to go home, or they had a fight with their spouse the day before and they are returning home from work and they're wondering how they're going to deal with that, and they're worried about it, and they feel rejected, they feel hurt. What's the tendency for that person? Do we call that a style, or do we just call it disorganized attachment tendency, or that there is no style because they never developed a way of coping, because the disorganized experience is one that doesn't have coping, doesn't have, some might say, style. So you might hear me saying disorganized attachment style, or disorganized attachment is one of the 4 attachment styles, whereas other people might say that disorganized attachment is not a style. It lacks style. It lacks an orientation. It lacks an organization. It lacks a pattern. It's just a lack of, it's like starting at the fundamental point of fear and panic. For the preoccupied person, there's fear and panic, and then there's a tendency to lean in and to feel and to demand and to be hypervigilant. For the avoidant person, there's a tendency to avoid and downplay. And this, for the secure person, there's a tendency to reach out and to have a balance of togetherness and separateness and ask for help within reason, right? So that's a style. Whereas disorganized people, you could argue they don't have a style. That's why we call it disorganized. There's nothing there. It's not organized in a particular orientation. They're just stuck in that initial phase of fear and panic. So it's just a matter of how you language it. And for me, I'm fine with either way of, because we're describing the same thing, right? It's if one person says disorganized attachment style and then proceeds to talk about the observation of childhood and adulthood disorganized attachment way, then it doesn't really matter if we call it a style or not a style, right? Whereas, the next person could say it's not, so yeah, I hope you get my point. All right, let's take a break. All right, back from the break. So just getting back to Dr. Pascal Vrticka's write-up here, what he says is, disorganized attachment is not another insecure attachment style, nor is it a more extreme form of insecure anxious or avoidant attachment style. Okay, so this is in line with what I was saying earlier. Going on, secure, insecure avoidant, and anxious attachment styles together. So he's using different terms, but so he's saying secure, avoidant, and preoccupied attachment styles together belong to the organized attachment styles. Disorganized attachment is a category on its own. So that's in line with what I was saying earlier. So I was predicting that that's what he was getting at, and that's what he is getting at. But okay, fine. So we call secure, preoccupied, and avoidant, we call them organized attachment styles. So then do we call disorganized a disorganized attachment style? Let's just call them all attachment styles. It doesn't really, it seems a bit pedantic, but going on. And some clinical literature will refer to them as the 4 attachment styles. So, anyway, going on. Also, disorganized attachment in children is not the same as fearful avoidant attachment style in adults. Fearful avoidant, and remember, so just chiming in, that fearful avoidant attachment in my system or my way of talking about it is just another term for disorganized attachment. So, let me just say what he's getting at, which is true, that when we look at the clinical literature and the research and the different authors that have coined these different terms, disorganized attachment tends to be used for children, most specifically when we're doing research regarding the strange situation and you're watching a child as the parent comes back into the lab room, the playroom. Listen to my whole deep dive on the strange situation. It has several steps, but in a nutshell, in case you forgot or you didn't listen to that episode or don't know the strange situation, you present a strange situation or a stranger situation to the child. So it's almost always the mother and the kid. The mother and the kid, 18 months old-ish, comes into this room. There's toys. There's a one-way mirror with researchers that are coding, or there's a video camera that's recording the child so you can code the behaviors later. And the mother and the kid walk into the room. And then the kid at first is in a strange situation. The kid's never been in that room before. What does the kid do? Almost all the time with securely attached kids, the kids will cling to the mother for a portion of time, but kind of be looking at the toys like, ooh. And then will, within a certain set of time, will start venturing off and playing with the toys. Now, the preoccupied kids will cling, and the avoidant kids will instantly run to the toys. This is a generalization, but you catch my drift. The disorganized kids, it's hard to say what they will do in a situation like this. But this is not the key moment of disorganized children observation. So then you have a researcher, this other person, it's usually a woman, she walks into the room, and you code the child's reaction. For the avoidant kids, they tend not to care that a random person has walked into the room. Actually, let me strike that from the record. They care, but they don't run to their caregiver. They don't run to their mother because because they avoid. They've had to avoid because they've run into so many situations where they feel attachment, fear, or distress, or fear of something, and the parent hasn't either been there physically or hasn't been there emotionally, or is just generally not or is very cold themselves or something. And so the child learns, I'm on my own. So I'm afraid of this random stranger, but there's no sense in running. And this is all unconscious for the most part. For the preoccupied kid, as soon as the stranger enters the lab, the child will cling to the parent, very, very intensely for a longer period of time, might even start having very visual or behavioral indicators of fear. Now, the secure kid will also run to their caregiver, but within a relatively short amount of time, the child will slowly start to venture off, maybe eye contact with the new lab person, or might, crawl back to the toys and play with them, a little tentatively. So the disorganized person, again, this isn't the key moment. Okay. Then the mom will leave the room and leave the child with the stranger. And again, avoidant kids tend to just continue playing with the toys. They might kind of glance a little with some, indicators of fear at the stranger, but they are just trying to be independent. They're just trying to distract themselves. This is a generalization. You can have avoidant kids that will cry. Anyway, preoccupied kid will freak out, generally speaking. The secure kid will also be afraid, because most 18-year-olds don't like to be left in a room with a stranger. But the secure kids will react with less loudness, not always, but there's that. Because they're afraid. The disorganized kids, again, there's a wide variety of behaviors that you'll see from disorganized kids. But when the parent comes back in, this is when you really see the disorganized kids shine, if you will, in that the mother comes back in, and for the disorganized kids, they've had all this fear that's been building up because the mom hasn't been in the room, and they've been left in this room that they aren't familiar with, and they're with a stranger they're not familiar with. So there's a fair amount of stress, a fair amount of attachment triggering of like, I must return to the secure base. It's a compulsion. It's a mandatory thing. Children don't make conscious decisions along these lines. Other animals will do this too, right? Particularly other primates, we will witness this behavior. And, it's ingrained in us. We're born with it. It's an evolved mechanism that clearly assists in our survival, and therefore our viability for procreation and sending our genes to the next generation. So for these children, for the disorganized kids, they have a deep, deep part of them that wants to run to the mother like the other kids do. So let me describe the other kids. The secure kids will run to the mother. They might cry and say, "Where were you?" Or indicate like, "Oh, you're back." But within a relatively short amount of time, they will regulate and maybe go back to the toys. The preoccupied kids will cling and might even punish the parents with maybe even violence. But at the very least, they will be very happy-ish that the parent has returned, but very distressed. They're signaling how upset they are. They might not ever return to the toys. The avoidant kid might also run to the mother, but it won't be as intense as the secure and preoccupied on average. And on average, they're going to return to the toys a lot quicker. The disorganized kid, though, has no organization to their desire to return to the secure base. So the avoidant kid, has some way of returning to the secure base in a pinch, but their general organization is through avoidance and dismissiveness, right? So they're just like, I don't need attachments. I'm fine on my own. So they're playing with toys. The secure person, the secure kid, they have an organization around, well, when I'm afraid, I run to my secure base. But once I'm fulfilled in that way, I can venture off into the world again and play with toys. For the preoccupied person, they're organized around a strategy of, you left me, and I am going to make sure you never do that again. And even though I want to go back and play with the toys, I'm not going to do that, because that would risk you leaving me again, or not learning from your horrible behavior that you left me here. And so I am going to cling to you out of panic, but also out of a way of trying to train you to never do this again. So this is an organization. This is how we call these organized attachment styles in a way. Whereas the disorganized kid, the mother comes back into the room, and you will see a variety of behaviors. And we are we are guessing as to what's going on inside their mind and their emotion centers. We can't know it, even if we do talk to 18-month-old children. They don't articulate themselves very well, so we have to infer. And the behavior we will see is there's a variety. You will see some disorganized kids collapse. You will see some scream. You will see some run to the parent, then run away. You will see some just stand like as if their brain is glitching. They will just be shaking. You will see that they're in distress. They're not avoidant. They are clearly upset, but they don't know what to do. And they are different in that they don't have any or if, because the avoidant kids will also reconnect with their mothers, but it will just be to a lesser extent, less intensity. They might not cry. At the very least, they will look at the mother, just, oh, okay, she's back in here. But with the disorganized kids, there doesn't seem to be any soothing. So it's not, there's no organization to it. They're just in that panic mode, right? And have no way of soothing themselves. And so they glitch, they scream, they run in circles, they might hit themselves, they might flop on the floor. They don't know what to do. The reason for this typically is because the mother is abusive, and so they have these equal and opposite forces at play. The mother comes into the room, and they have this force that is compelling them to run to the secure base, to the person designated as caregiver, as mother. But they have this equal impulse to run away from that monster. That's a monster that just entered the room. I need to run away from that person. And it's not an intellectual decision. It's a physiological, neurological, evolutionary response, and the child just glitches. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about disorganized. Now, when we're talking about fearful avoidant attachment, this label, we are talking about how when we started to observe attachment style in children, it's pretty easy to do in this lab experiment. Adults are more complicated because they have ways of thinking, they have ways of remembering, they have ways of masking, Children don't, typically. 18-month-old children, they haven't learned how to mask their shameful behavior or their emotions. You could say avoidant kids do have a little bit of that, but they're not super conscious of it, if at all. So adults, though, have a lot of layers upon layers of coping consciously and unconsciously. So if you saw an adult, you can't create a lab scenario that will easily distinguish between the different attachment styles for adults or different personalities or whatever. So we have to have much more elaborate ways of evaluating those, and aside from having an invisible drone that follows the individual around and reads their mind for a year and then codes their behavior, and then you can start to have a conceptualization of where this person is in terms of whatever groups we would figure out. The much less expensive, more viable way of assessing someone's attachment style or relationship style or their emotion style is to ask them questions. And some of the questions are very overt, like, what do you do when you feel rejected? But some of the questions are more subtle, and the answers are, unless the person knows the test, they don't know how to game the system, Like if you had an adult who wanted to appear secure even though they have preoccupied attachment style, if they knew enough about these attachment styles, they could kind of detect some questions and game the system, right? But some of the questions on some of the measures don't have that. Like they'll ask questions about, tell me about your childhood and this kind of thing, or your early childhood relationships. And there are certain indicators, like the avoidant person will tend to say everything's fine, but they don't give much detail. The preoccupied person will have, if they're answering honestly, they'll have a lot of detail because they retain a lot of these things, not only because they're paying attention, and they're also not paying attention to themselves. They're very other-oriented, but they also hold a lot of grudges for the reasons that I've talked about. And so They have a lot of very specific memories, often negative, not all the time, but often. Secure people tend to see the good with a little bit of bad, depending on how in depth they go. So there's different style, and not everyone would know how to answer to game that system. You know what I mean? Because it's just an open-ended question. Tell me about your childhood. So I'm oversimplifying here, but when we look at adults, these are 25, 45-year-old people, and they act and behave and react in very different ways in the way that we see in 18-month-old children. And we will categorize these adults as best we can. And then we start correlating them to, we match them theoretically or hypothetically to the different attachment styles that children go through. So you will see an adult that has the markers of adult style preoccupied attachment, and it's very different from the 18-month-old behaviors, right, that we code. They're measured differently. And we say, are those related? Do you have indicators, or can you do longitudinal studies where you actually measure an 18-month-old child's attachment style, and then you check it in with them when they're 30? Do they have the same attachment style, but in an adult version? And that's so the long and short of it is there's research on this, and some of it's pretty robust, but it's hard to be as robust as it needs to be. And there's loose associations between these groups. And what people will say is that there's not a lot of science that links these things together, and therefore they're not the same thing, or that your early childhood attachment style has nothing to do with what you will be like later, or what you are now has nothing to do with what you were as a child. But it's one, more complicated than that, and two, we just don't know, because we're talking about, like I said earlier, we're trying to codify and measure, arguably the largest aspect of human existence, relationships and attachment and romance and, the way you feel about things and the decisions, culture plays a role, right? Also, and researchers will acknowledge this, that you can change your attachment style. So if you have preoccupied attachment style at 18 months, things can be, given your environment and the way you interpret things can be different by the time you're an adult. Have you been through a lot of therapy? Did things go worse? Did things go better? Could you have an 18-month-old child that was measured as securely attached, very firmly securely attached, had a balance, right? But went through horrific divorce, and their parents go through a horrible thing. Dad abandons the family. The kid has attachment injury from that, develops avoidant attachment style, and by the time they're 30 and they've had some bad relationships and culture, if it's a guy, he's had influence on like being stoic and stuff, and he's listening to a lot of Jordan Peterson, and he's 30 years old, and when you measure his attachment style at that point, he's avoidant. So you have secure as a child and avoidant as an adult, and people will say, well, therefore they're different things, or this is all nonsense. And what we would say is, well, life is long, and there's a lot of influences, and of course, no one would think that the attachment style that you had as a child will be fixed. We understand that. Now, when it comes to disorganized attachment, it's a little different in that a lot of the times, at least anecdotally, okay, when you have a disorganized attachment as a young child, especially if it's firmly measured, then I would say the consensus is, and I would argue that this is very likely the case, that for those people, they're going to have some signs of disorganized, what I would call disorganized attachment as adult, what I tend to call disorganized attachment as adult, what others would call fearful avoidant as an adult, but that's in a way just another term for disorganized. But other people, including Dr. Pascal, would say that they're not the same thing. They're completely different terms. But it confuses people when you say that disorganized attachment has nothing to do with fearful avoidant attachment style. And so then you have lay people and students and clinicians that are like, oh, okay, so what's fearful avoidant? And well, it's a completely different thing. But to help people understand, and I think it is a useful way of seeing the world, that the disorganized, what we talk about when we talk about disorganized attachment style as a child, it seems likely, but we can't know, and there's some evidence to support this, some evidence that doesn't support it. But given how difficult it is to measure this, it's hard to know. But there's, in terms of what we call fearful avoidant, or what I and other people might call disorganized attachment as adult, if you've listened to the podcast with me and Bob, I talk a lot about this, that the same experience happens to the adults. Like with Bob, he will talk about how he is desperate for closeness, but the closer he gets, the more fearful he gets, the more paranoid he gets, the more convinced of foul play or just panic that he feels, discomfort that he feels. And it's hard, right? And as he gains distance because of the fear he feels as he gets closer to someone, he feels a lot of distress there too. There's no orientation. There's no system of dealing with it. Preoccupied people will deal with, I've already talked about that. Avoidant people will deal with like secure people. Disorganized people, they're just stuck in this limbo of fear and being unresolved, as they will use that word. So they're fearful, they're avoidant, and, I don't know if you hear that airplane, but fearful, avoidant, when you get more specific into the way that adults will tend to enact disorganized attachment, fearful, avoidant does kind of fit, right? They're fearful as they get closer, and they also will avoid, but they also will pursue. They're not oriented towards avoidant, but if you understand what they mean by avoidant, then you understand what they're referring to. Anyway, so I find it's just easier to use the same word, even though technically speaking, in the measures, they will. Specifically, or particularly the main measures that are used, they don't use disorganized as the label for adults, generally speaking. But they're talking about disorganized attachment is the thing. But then, what Dr. Pascal would say is, well, why are you doing that? You're, speaking unscientifically. There's no science to prove, blah, 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 blah. Again, it's a model for understanding. It tends to work out. It is hard to know if this is accurate or not. In 50 years, maybe people will hear me and say, wow, he was right about this, he was wrong about that. I don't know. I try to avoid getting into specific things that are more out there in terms of their speculation. And I also try to avoid becoming too pedantic about what the research has shown, because at some point each clinician has to make a call, right? Like science can only get you so far. Data can only get us clinicians so far. And then at some point we as clinicians, I would argue as philosophers, we are philosophers of the human condition and of change and of morality and what's good in life and how to see the world, okay? There's no science behind how one should see the world or how one should live. Now, therapists, we're not here to tell people how to live, but we do filter especially if you get into depth with clients, we end up having a lot of thoughts on that. We have to question our values. We have to question our culture. We have to question our authority and our privilege. But I think to be ultimately helpful to a human being, we have to enter that realm. We can't just be standoffish and say, well, there's no science to tell me anything about this, so I'm just going to stare at you because I don't know what to do. I'm only going to reside within science. For me, I'm one of the most annoying, pedantic, scientific people around. I'm constantly railing on people that don't follow the science. And yet, with therapy, with life, with myself, with helping people, with my marriage, science really barely gets us down the road in terms of how we're supposed to navigate this. Therapists need wisdom They need philosophy. They need life. They need a way of understanding humans and themselves, and science can inform that. So when it comes to the pedantry of these terms and attachments in attachment theory, I tend to, be practical and develop my way. But if someone want to criticize my word usage, that's fine. But I would be able to counter them by saying, yeah, you're right. And while I acknowledge that, I'm trying to educate people. I'm trying to help clients. I'm trying to even organize my own thoughts around this. And it just helps to see it this way. And I think it does pan out that kids that are observed to have disorganized attachment pretty firmly when they're 18 months old will tend to have, because the other thing is like disorganized attached adults, they can have the look of relationships that everything is fine. Like Bob, for example, from the outside and from a lot of measures, his relationships are fine. He's not volatile. He's not violent. He's been married for a long time. He's been with Colleen a really long time. And if you ask them, they would say they're happy in their marriage and they wouldn't be lying. But when, if you listen to the podcast with Bob, you hear his inner experience. It's different than the kinds of things you would see or hear on a survey or, gather from, say Bob wasn't a therapist and he didn't have as much self-awareness. How would he respond to a survey, right? Especially if it was like a short one online. Can you be assured that it's measuring the actual thing? Same with preoccupied, same with avoidant people. It's just hard to measure this in adults is the thing. And that's why for myself, when I'm working with humans or when I'm thinking about myself or my marriage, I am using all the research and the data and the theory, and I'm using it to inform my conceptualization of a situation. But if you asked me to prove that my conceptualization is accurate, I would say I actually have almost no ability to do that. And then other people would say, well, then you're just making up a story. And then I would say, well, we have to, because science can only tell us extremely limited stories about people. And we have to have some system. We shouldn't just make shit up, but, we should try. And there's consensi in the world. The only thing we can really say about personality is the big five. And that's just 5 aspects, openness and conscientiousness, that whole stuff. And those are useful, but even that has some question marks around, especially with individual measurement. And they're only, loosely associated with certain observations of behavior and life and stuff. And that's just extremely limited, anyway. So let's take a break, but there's a bunch of myths, and I was planning on getting to all of them. I think there's, like 34 myths, and I've only got to 1. So let's kind of race through the next 33. All right, we're back from the break. Maybe I'll break this up into 2 different episodes, but this next myth by Dr. Pascal Vrticka, who I greatly respect the way this is written. It is all true. It's just a matter of how you apply this. And him posting this on Instagram and online is a really good thing, because there's a lot of bullshit on Instagram and TikTok and on the internet regarding attachment theory. But anyway, so this next statement is meant to dispel a myth. And the statement is, attachment is not good or bad, and it's not weak or strong. And I think we understand what this one is getting at, but let's read it. Attachment is our primary social survival strategy. We cannot survive or thrive without it. Attachment ensures our access to co-regulation or social allostasis. We therefore all must be attached to at least one and ideally several attachment figures across the lifespan. Yeah. Attachment theory, above all, asks about our attachment quality. Attachment theory, above all, asks about our attachment quality, how our attachment makes us feel and think within our relationships, and whether it is useful and helpful in everyday life. Just because some attachment patterns are labeled as insecure or disorganized does not make them bad or useless as such. Right. So I think what he's getting at, which is something that I would get at, is that the attachment style, and I'm just going to continue referring to disorganized as one of the attachment styles. You could argue that's not, and in his language, he's like labeled insecure or disorganized, meaning that insecure styles are an organized insecure, and you have insecure disorganized. Anyway, I don't find that actually the distinction particularly helpful. But anyway, so what he's getting at, which I absolutely agree with, is that the style is good. Disorganized and preoccupied and avoidant are good in that they helped the child and maybe even the adult cope with bad situations, right? If your parent is inconsistent and occasionally abandoning, then it serves you and your attachment needs, and maybe even your survival, to amp up your emotions, to cling, to demand, to alert, to focus on the parent, to try to game the system. And if you're avoidant, it makes sense. It's helpful. It's good. It's strong to turn off your emotions as best you can, to turn away. What's the point? You're not going to get your needs met from that person. You're just going to be frustrated. You're just going to be left alone. You're just going to be neglected, ignored, unattuned to. And you're better off just trying to make it on your own. Maybe even building up a narcissistic idea that you are stronger than everyone. You're superior. You're better. And that way of dealing with it is strong. It's good because it helps you. That's why so many people around the planet, if we have 8 billion people on the planet, statistically 1 or 2 billion of those people are avoidant. And another 1 or 2 billion are preoccupied, and another, say, 500 million are disorganized. So, if so many people are doing it, it can't, and they're doing it automatically, it can't be like a weak thing, and putting good or bad to it is a little silly, right? So, it's like saying that PTSD is weak and bad. Now, what do we mean by bad? But I think what they're getting at is like online, it's like you want to avoid bad attached people or something, and that's just reductive and stigmatizing. All right, actually, let's say goodbye for now and tune in next time when I continue reading these, because I want to read all of them. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.